Hi everyone, I'm Helen McIntyre. I'm Head of Evidence at the Campaign to End Loneliness, and just to follow on from Pam's welcome, I'd just like to say how delighted we are to welcome so many of you to this Research and Policy Forum on new research directions in loneliness measurement. And I hear that the Prime Minister's just resigned, so very good that you're prioritising us over that drama.
I'm on a meeting and someone's...
Sorry, I think someone needs to possibly mute. So this promises to be a really engaging and interesting afternoon, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our speakers, from Jennifer, from Tim and Fuchsia, and the follow-on conversation with all of you who are able to stay on for that. But just before that, I thought it would be good for me to give you a bit of context to this topic of loneliness measurement from the point of view of the campaign. And I'm just going to take a few minutes to do that, if that's okay with you. So the Campaign to End Loneliness forms part of the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, and both organisations have produced guidance on measuring loneliness. The campaign Measuring Your Impact Guide was written in 2015. So that was when we still had a sole focus on older age groups, hence the title. We now campaign on loneliness across the age range. And the guide also predates government guidance on loneliness measurements. So it was mainly intended for use by organisations working to address loneliness who want to measure their impact. And the guide details a number of widely used measures and some pros and cons of using them. It includes the UCLA-3 scale, which we'll come back to, and the de Jong-Geerveld scale. And it also includes the Campaign to End Loneliness measurement tool, which is notable in parts because it only contains positively worded items. And I think particularly for that reason, we still have quite a few inquiries from people who are interested in using the campaign measure. However, as many of you know, there's now a set of measures recommended by the government as set out in the Tackling Loneliness Strategy and by the ONS in 2018. And organisations and researchers are encouraged there to use these recommended measures in order to simplify monitoring of loneliness, to make clear the impact of policy and of work done to address the issue, essentially so that measurement is then made comparable across different interventions and can feed into the evidence base around what works to address loneliness. And those recommended measures are the ones included in the 2019 What Works Centre for Wellbeing Brief Guide, alongside a set of other wellbeing measures that are likely to be associated with loneliness. So here are the recommended measures. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with them. The 3-item UCLA scale with indirect measurement items about frequency of lacking companionship, feeling left out, and feeling isolated from others. And then there's this single additional direct measure about frequency of loneliness. And the recommendation is that if you're only able to ask one question about loneliness, that this should be it. So I've got an example here. And this is one of the ways we have found this last very broad brush, I suppose, single direct question useful. And that's in relation to loneliness during COVID-19. So in April 2021, the ONS published analysis from their Opinions and Lifestyle Survey using this question, which they were asking fortnightly: how often do you feel lonely? And they compared the proportion of UK adults who said they were experiencing loneliness often or always, pre-COVID, during the first lockdown, and in the period covering the 2020 to 2021 winter lockdowns. For simplicity, I've only included the mean percentages and numbers here. So the ONS noted no change in loneliness during that first lockdown period, where it was at a similar level to the pre-pandemic level of loneliness. Perhaps that was time when everyone was rallying round. But during the winter lockdowns, when the pandemic was really dragging, perhaps when people were reflecting on their loneliness as well, they pointed out that there was this jump. So there were approximately an extra 1 million people estimated to perceive themselves as being lonely, often or always. And since then, the ONS has kindly continued to provide us with this data quarterly so that we can analyse it. And although the numbers are not becoming significantly bigger, they don't appear to be returning to where they were before. So this for us has provided a useful and a very clear reminder that the issue is still an incredibly pressing one. So that's an example of how the recommended direct question has been of use to us. But we also know that measurement of loneliness continues to be a live issue for both researchers and practitioners. And there's a lot that particular measures, including the recommended ones, can't tell us. And there is certainly ongoing critical examination of the properties of particular measures by researchers. So we, as a campaign, are keen to continue the conversation around this, which is the reason for our 2 forums on the subject. And we're recognising that scrutiny is important because, as Marlies Mace and Pam and colleagues say in the introduction to this review of measurement scales, measures are the foundation of our research work and hence form the basis of our conclusions and recommendations. We use measures to obtain our findings, therefore it's crucial to understand their quality. And also Simon Hunter from Glasgow Caledonian University wrote a blog for us in anticipation of this event, which is well worth having a read of if you haven't already. And he highlights 3 big measurement issues, some of which will be addressed today and which I'll mention again later, just kind of examples of how this issue continues to be discussed and examined. Finally, I also want to kind of reiterate what Pam said at the beginning, and important to mention is that the issue of measurement continues to be raised with us by practitioners working with various groups to address loneliness. For example, there's sometimes frustration that measures don't seem sensitive to changes in loneliness that qualitative information suggests are taking place. And we're going to return to that issue of making measures useful for practitioners, as Pam said, at our next forum on November the 24th. So today is about future research directions in loneliness measurements. And kind of as we kick off, if you have any specific questions or comments that you hope will be addressed today, or more generally as part of the discussion on this subject, please do pop those in the chat, as it's useful for us to know what your concerns and thinking is. And we can perhaps pick up on some of those key concerns and areas of interest in the breakout rooms later. But to kick off properly, back to you, Pam.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much, Helen. That's a really nice overview of today's event and gives us some really nice, useful insight, I think, into the discussions. So I'm going to now introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Professor Jennifer Lau, who is Professor of Youth Resilience, and she's the co-director of the Youth Resilience Unit at Queen Mary's University in London. Now, I've known Jennifer probably for 3 years, I think. Wonderful researcher. I think it's going to be a great talk today. And she's going to talk to us about the measurement of loneliness and to pick up on the need for accurate measurement of loneliness and the need to specifically look at measurement in the general population, but also for specific groups too. She'll also pick up on what Helen's just talked about in the need for loneliness measures to be able to pick up changes. Really what we're interested in, particularly when we're thinking about interventions, is how people come out of loneliness. So we want to be able to pick up on that really appropriately. She's also going to give us some nice insight into a new project that she's had some funding for, which is to develop a loneliness measure for children and young people. So over to you, Jennifer. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Pam. And thanks, Helen, for inviting me today. So let me just share my screen. And whilst I'm doing that, to kind of caveat this, that I'm not an expert in measurement. I'm just here sharing with you some of the experiences I've had as a loneliness researcher, and particularly a researcher interested in young people. So, I thought, because I was the first speaker today, that it was perhaps worth taking a step back and thinking about why measurement is important. And the reason it's important, and I guess one of the reasons why we're all here today, is because loneliness is associated with negative consequences for mental health and physical health, healthcare burden, quality of life and not quite reaching your full potential and thriving in life, and eventually early death as well. So, under what circumstances do we need measurement, or accurate measurement, precise measurement? So first of all, for epidemiological reasons, for kind of monitoring trends across a society, or between societies, or between time periods. So we want to be able to estimate the proportion of individuals who experience loneliness. So what is the scope of the problem that we are thinking about? And of course, this is also useful for looking at change across a big event, for example, like the pandemic. And as I said before, also across different societies, countries, and maybe across time, not necessarily across a particular event. It's useful also, we want to be able to measure loneliness in terms of identifying individuals or subgroups who might be most at risk for loneliness, and therefore its kind of negative consequences, in terms of perhaps age groups and also marginalized groups as well, if we are to kind of make sure that those people get help that they need. And it's useful for monitoring interventions as well, for evaluating interventions. So I use the term intervention loosely here, not just to mean medical or clinical interventions, but sort of community-based programs, policies, anything that is designed to intervene, to stop something, to stop a negative outcome. And we need accurate measurement of loneliness here in order to be able to see whether or not a particular program or intervention or policy that's designed to reduce loneliness, either directly or indirectly, is working. And similarly, to kind of drive research into what the best interventions are as well, we need good measures of loneliness in order to study the kind of mechanisms that contribute towards loneliness, so that when we then develop those interventions, programs, policies, we are targeting the right kinds of mechanisms that we think contribute towards loneliness. So what happens if measurement isn't quite precise? So we might under or overestimate numbers in terms of epidemiological analysis. We might overlook certain at-risk groups, so the people who need help aren't delivered that help. We might be more likely to discount certain interventions because they don't seem to work if we're not able to accurately measure those changes across time. And we might decide on the wrong kinds of intervention targets because, again, the research which is based on our measures of loneliness are slightly off target because of that. So what is it that we are trying to measure? So I thought, again, it was worth kind of coming back to the definition or concept of loneliness. And it's a pretty complex and multifaceted set of behaviours and also emotions and cognitions as well. So first of all, to say it's a subjective feeling. So given that it is subjective, it's different from the kind of objective social isolation measures, but it's subjective, so perhaps the best way of getting at it is self-report. It's unwelcome, so mostly negative set of emotions that can be distressing, uncomfortable. And those emotions are around a kind of a lack of or a perceived loss of companionship, so some kind of disconnect with other people. But apart from those kind of more emotional aspects, there's also a kind of a more meta or more kind of cognitive aspect, which is about a perceived discrepancy between what you think you have and what you want as well. So a more kind of cognitive angle to it. And that discrepancy can be both about quantity and the quality of relationships. So it's quite a, as I said, quite a kind of multifaceted, multi-component set of experiences. And so the challenge is to get all of that into a measure. So there are different ways of measuring loneliness. There are single item measures of loneliness. So in some ways, these are the most direct, because what you're asking is to go to the person and actually say, how lonely do you feel? You don't define lonely, you kind of depend on their understanding and realization of those experiences. And then you give them a set of response options, usually that are based on the frequency of those experiences. So the advantages of this is that it's simple and easy to complete, so accessibility is high. It relies on this kind of accessibility to your own subjective experience. It relies on people's gut feelings. And sometimes we don't want people to kind of overthink certain things. We just want to know, is this something that you've experienced or not? It's scalable, so you can do this in large cohorts. So the kinds of cohorts, the ONS data, for example, it was easy to kind of do single cohorts and get large numbers for that. And also to track interventions, again, it's feasible, it's easy, it's practical, and so people are more likely to do it. So you can evaluate these interventions better. But there are also a number of limitations as well. So first of all, it's been argued that it could be stigmatizing. So because it's so direct about loneliness, if that's a stigmatizing thing, people are less likely to endorse it. But I guess the opposite is also true, that you might also get demand effects. So people kind of saying that they're lonely because they think that's what the research is about. It doesn't seem to quite capture the complexity of the concept that I was talking about earlier. And that's a problem, because it might be that different people are then endorsing this item on the basis of many of those features about loneliness. So it might be that you have people who are interpreting the concept a little bit different. So in the end, you kind of have apples and pears at the same time. And also, in terms of high scores, because the response options tend to be about frequency, you don't really capture the intensity of the experiences and also the duration, so how long those feelings have been going on for. So an alternative is to use kind of more indirect measures of loneliness. So these are some examples that Helen spoke about earlier. So in some ways, these seem to capture the construct more fully. So they kind of have a richer set of behaviors, emotions, and cognitions that are associated with loneliness. But they are a little bit more time consuming to complete. And you have to think more about what kinds of language you use and whether or not people are understanding of those terms. And then you also need to make sure that they meet certain psychometric standards. So in terms of reliability to all of your different questions, do they all tap the same thing? And in terms of validity, are they measuring what they're meant to measure? And also something that we need to maybe think about moving forward, and maybe Tim's talk will talk more about this, is to consider how high is a high score. We don't yet have cutoff scores for kind of more problematic forms of loneliness. Now, I just want to end by telling you, to make a pitch really about the research that we're doing, which is trying to measure loneliness with young people and why that's important. So first of all, it seems that during the pandemic, they were one of the groups who were most kind of vulnerable to kind of so-called lockdown loneliness. So these are some statistics from ONS. And this probably captures it a bit nicer, more sort of graphic. This is a word cloud of what young people said when we asked them what they were worried about during the pandemic. And although a lot of them were worried about university, school and work, friends came out quite high as well. So the size of the word here indexes how many people mentioned that as a worry. Also, young people say that loneliness is still very much stigmatized and that there is an invisible wall to talking about loneliness. So by measuring it more, you're sort of you're opening a dialogue about it. And of course, we want to be able to drive interventions forward for loneliness for young people, of which there are fewer compared to older adults. Youth is also a transitional period, so there are social, biological and psychological changes, which may explain why we sort of get increases in the frequency of loneliness experiences in that period. But also the fact that some of these behaviours, thoughts and feelings can become more habitual and persistent. But at the same time, it might also be an opportunity to kind of learn ways of managing loneliness more effectively. So all in all, kind of a pitch for why looking at loneliness in young people. So some of the current measures for loneliness in young people, some of the problems with them are similar to the ones I talked about for the general population. So stigmatizing, not really having cutoff scores, and also thinking about severe loneliness in terms of frequency. But the main problem with them is that a lot of the measures for loneliness for young people were either extrapolated from measures for older adults, and so some of the nature of the experiences of loneliness in young people might not necessarily be captured. And also, they might not be sensitive to changes even within youth as well. So it doesn't quite capture the authenticity of loneliness experiences in young people. And also the kind of psychometrics, so the kind of reliability and validity that I mentioned earlier have not been well established either. So myself and also Pam and a colleague Delia, two young people co-researchers with partners at Campaign to End Loneliness and McPin Foundation were recently awarded a cross-council UKRI grant to try to develop an age-sensitive measure of loneliness for young people. So it's a multidisciplinary team, and we have young people co-applicants, but also co-researchers as well. We will have a young person advisory group supported by McPin, and we have a dissemination strategy at multiple levels, working together with the campaign. So it's a 6-step approach of what we're going to do to developing and evaluating this new measure, and we'll be doing data collection, so each of these stages in London and Manchester, to kind of increase the diversity of the sample and the generalisability of it as well. So first of all, in terms of developing a new measure, what we'll do is we'll look at the existing literature to see what kinds of concepts and constructs are important for loneliness in young people. We'll then run some focus groups and also some arts workshops to try to get young people to talk about their loneliness experiences and use those to generate new items. The arts workshops is a kind of a new idea where we'd be working with artists, so not simply thinking about loneliness in a kind of a traditional focus group where you're talking about it, but using different art forms to express that, to identify themes of loneliness. We'll then use that initial item pool and get experts that are both academics but also lived experience young people to kind of rate those items for their relevance, representativeness, and whether or not they are easy to understand or not. We'll then test those items again with 16 young people, getting them to kind of do the measure but also think aloud whilst they're doing it to kind of further refine some of those items. And then we'll create the scale, which we'll administer online to around 1,800 young people. And then we'll do some fancy statistical analysis on it to look at the psychometric properties to make sure it's reliable and also valid. Once that measure is is peer reviewed in about 3 years' time, or well, maybe 2.5 years' time, hopefully, we'll then disseminate the measure and through workshops where there'll be further opportunities to kind of get feedback and to refine it. And I guess at this stage, what I wanted to say was that it's a long process, but it would be really, really great. We're always happy to kind of have more people on board. So if anyone has any ideas, would like to kind of give us some of their opinions, we would very much welcome that. So I think it would be ironic, given that we study loneliness, to be developing a measure like this in isolation. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. That was really nice talk. Now I see we haven't got any questions in the chat for you, but has anybody got a question that they would like to ask Jennifer? You can put it in chat if you like, or you can put your hand up and I will come to you. No, that's interesting. Oh, we have one. We have one from Christian. Are you going to preprint publish it?
Yes, I think so. Yes, yeah, we are going to try and be as transparent and as open as we are. So we will once we have the findings at end of each of these stages, that's the idea.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks, Jennifer. Daniel, you have your hand up.
Thanks, folks. That's a really interesting talk. I know recently there was a few reports published that loneliness is increasing in younger people. So I like the fact that you're starting to look at this now. But I was wondering, why do people tend to stick with the questionnaire subjective-based measurements? Have you and your team considered behavioral measurements? So, for example, scenario building, either in the real world or in virtual reality, and then getting people to, like, observing them do things and trying to infer loneliness that way?
Oh, so sort of like coding, seeing what they do. And then, I mean, I think there are sort of observations, and there are sets of behaviors and cognitions that are associated with loneliness, but I think at this stage they're sort of more correlated. So I think it's the same with things like anxiety and depression. For a lot of these things, we sort of measure them through self-report because they are subjective experiences. And whilst you might say that, you know, someone who is more lonely might act in a certain way, I suppose those things are still correlated. They're not sort of they might not 100% sort of explain the set of behaviors. So I think it's nice to have complementary measures where you have self-report and maybe observations and maybe, I don't know, something a bit more real life like diaries or things like that to kind of supplement the construct. But in terms of getting at loneliness and kind of identifying those people who are most in need of kind of help or self-management, I think would still be self-report, unless you have any suggestions of something that you think, because it's still such a kind of subjective thing that even if you watch someone interacting with people, you still can't quite get in their head about what's going on.
Okay, thanks.
Do you want to come back on that, Daniel?
Yeah, if I may follow on. So my background, I'm a computer scientist. I was recently awarded UKRI funding from ESRC to study loneliness and using virtual reality as an intervention. So I guess where I'm coming from is, in my field, we like buzzwords like big data, right? So I'm thinking, why not build a platform, and rather than running several workshops with small samples, we could capture thousands and thousands of people, right? And the trick with correlation is, if you get enough of it, it can be very, very powerful. So companies like Facebook, they are all based on correlational data, but their predictions are super, super accurate. So I was just wondering why nobody seems, I may be naive here, but nobody I've interacted with over the past year has even considered this as a potential route. I was just wondering why. Like, is there an obvious reason that it's a bad idea that I'm not seeing?
I think Jennifer's right. It's because it's subjective. It's in people's heads, and there are some behavioral features, not many, and they are very idiosyncratic. So I think there is a concern that we may not be able to spot people through behaviour. But of course, it's not been done on a massive grand scale. And you're thinking that you would be able to do that. So it'll be really interesting to see what you find, whether those individuals who are reporting higher loneliness, do they engage online in a different way? Are there key behavioural features? It will be really fascinating to see if there are, or if there are different profiles. Yeah, so I think it's just that it's never been able to be done on such a big level, a big scale. So yeah, we're looking forward to you feeding back, Daniel, I think. Yeah. The other thing, and maybe Tim, you will pick up on this a bit later, is that idea of other people being able to report on loneliness, because you've done some lovely work, haven't you, Tim, where you've been able to show that other people actually can spot loneliness. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, so what we've done in our research is we got people to complete a self-report loneliness measure, but then we also gave questionnaires to people who knew them well, and got them to comment on the individual based on their observations, including whether they seemed lonely. And actually the correlation between the informant reports was pretty good in terms of its agreement with the self-report. It wasn't perfect by any means, so I don't think we could rely on informant data only. I think we would miss some lonely people, but I think as Jennifer was saying, it could be useful as a complementary measure, especially for validation purposes. So for example, if you're doing a study which relies entirely on self-report measures, then you could overestimate some associations. But if you can show that an informant report of loneliness shows the same effects that you observed with self-report, that's a good kind of way of validating your findings.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, thank you for that. I think we've got time just for one more question. So I'm going to go with Christina because she had her hand up before you, Claire. But Claire, if you could put your question in chat for us. I can see that Jennifer is working her way through answering those chat questions, so she'll be able to get round to you. So Christina, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah. Well, I've got a comment now as well, I'm afraid. I mean,
okay.
In relation to the big data kind of thing, I think it's very important to just remember that association is not causation. And cross-sectional data, we can have a correlation of 99.9%, but it doesn't necessarily mean we can't determine the directionality. And so I think we just need to be careful about that and read Bradford Hill's criteria for determining if a correlation is associational. So I think, because I think we have a lot of cross-sectional data and we infer causation when it isn't necessarily correct. But actually the point I had wanted to make, but it seems a long time away now, is thinking about measuring change and how we measure what I spend a lot of my time in public health. What is a clinically significant change and what is just a bit of noise? And the degree to which Jennifer and colleagues could calibrate that, I think would be really useful, because we may see a 1 point change on a scale and then we get excited. Again, could be statistically significant, but I think it's translating that what is a level of change that makes a difference to the lives of individuals, and that may vary over time, may vary with age group, may vary with all sorts of things. So
I think that's a really important point, Christina, so thank you for making that. I mean,
Public Health 101. Sorry.
but it's something really important for us all to be thinking about, particularly where those of you that are working in interventions, looking for a significant change. Actually, what you want to be doing is to be thinking, have we got a change and is it meaningful for that person? It's not necessarily about statistical change, and it's about understanding what that meaningful change will look like on a measure. And I know that Jennifer, leading the UKRI grant, has some of that in mind. So hopefully be able to tap some of that, alongside cut-off points.
Hard to do, but
really very hard to do, very hard, but really fundamental, I think, if we're going to move the field forward. Yeah, thank you very much, Christina. Okay, we'll move on now to hear from Tim Matthews. Tim, I've known for a long time now, since he was a PhD student, which does seem a long time ago, doesn't it, Tim? But making a wonderful career for himself, so incredibly well done. He's currently a British Academy postdoctoral research fellow at King's College in London. And he's going to talk today about measurement with the view of thinking about transient, so almost normative, adaptable experiences versus chronic loneliness. Now, I'm not going to say any more because I don't want to take any more time up. So Tim, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Pam, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to put my slides up. There we are. Okay, well, I appreciate this opportunity to speak to you about some of the issues around measurement of loneliness. And as Pam said, I'm going to be talking about how we approach the temporal nature of loneliness. In other words, getting at these chronic versus transient forms of it. So to begin with, I'm going to go right back to where it all started, because scientific interest in loneliness is a fairly recent phenomenon. There were a few case studies reported by clinicians back in the 50s and 60s, but it wasn't until the late 70s really that people tried to produce reliable and valid scales for measuring loneliness, such as the UCLA scale and the de Jong-Gierveld scale. What's interesting, I think, is that these measures haven't changed a great deal since those days. There have been tweaks that have been made, such as reverse coding some items, and there have been various short forms developed from the original scales. But the way in which they conceptualize and address the phenomena of loneliness is fundamentally the same as it was when these scales were first developed, even though subsequent research has taught us quite a bit about the experience of loneliness. We know a lot more about it now than we did 50 years ago. And also the world in which we live has changed a lot. With the changes in digital technology, the meaning of what it is to be socially embedded or social has been completely transformed, which could have implications for the way we measure loneliness today. So here are some examples from some of the most common measures that are used to address loneliness. And in particular, I want to draw attention to the temporality of these questions. So that is the period of time in which people are saying they've experienced these things. So we've got the UCLA 3, it asks, how often do you feel you lack companionship? The de Jong-Gierveld scale, this item is, I find my circle of friends too limited, presumably in general. There's the directly worded item recommended by the ONS, and again, that asks how often do you feel lonely? And then the personal resource questionnaire, again, that asks about how things are seemingly in general or in the here and now. So I guess what we're seeing here is that all these measures are covering either a very recent reporting period or an unspecified one. And then on top of that, some measures will ask how often you feel these things, but rarely do they ask how long have you felt this way. And why is that an issue? Well, because ever since the early days of the loneliness literature, we've known that there is a distinction between more temporary loneliness and more persistent forms that follow people for longer periods of time. And from a research point of view, it would be interesting to see if these different temporal profiles of loneliness might have different sets of risk factors or different sets of outcomes. And while there's growing interest in studying these, there's still no real consensus about how we as researchers can draw a valid distinction between one form of loneliness and the other. So these are the issues that we're facing. First of all, how do we define what constitutes transient loneliness and what constitutes chronic loneliness? We can probably speculate that transient loneliness is something that arises due to the circumstances people find themselves in, like an acute crisis or a life transition. Whereas chronic loneliness might arise when people get stuck in a kind of vicious cycle due to difficulties with coping or negative patterns of thinking. So even though both of these people may describe the same sets of feelings on a measure such as the UCLA, the mechanisms underlying them could be quite different. But then how do we measure these different profiles of loneliness empirically and reliably? Well, first, we need to use longitudinal data, obviously with repeated measures of loneliness collected across time, preferably with lots of time points with small intervals between them, in order to see how loneliness kind of develops over time. And an example of how that can be done is through these longitudinal modeling approaches that identify hidden trajectories within the data. So this is from a paper by Pamela and colleagues. What you tend to see with these types of models is you get a group of people who are very low in loneliness and stay low. And then you've got people who increase in loneliness over time from a low starting point. And then people who start high in loneliness, but then decrease over time. And then there are the people who are very lonely consistently across the whole time window. And that's a pattern that's commonly observed, not just for loneliness, but for many other psychological phenomena. One issue, though, is that most of these kinds of studies have been done specifically in children and adolescents. Unfortunately, many of the big cohort studies that followed people all the way into adulthood didn't collect measures on loneliness in their early waves. So we can only really generalize these data to younger people. And the issue there is that when we talk about chronic loneliness, we're at least partly thinking of loneliness that persists long into mid to late life and exerts this wear and tear effect on health and foreshadows early mortality. Whereas all we can infer from these data is a snapshot of how things are early on, and we don't know yet where things go next or whether these trajectories hold true across later ages. It could be that some of them branch out into a more complex set of patterns over adulthood. So to that end, we would need to see loneliness measures incorporated into much longer follow-ups, and there is growing interest in doing that now, especially since the pandemic. But then also, not all studies have these fine-grained repeated measures. They may only have 2 or 3 data points, and so they have to come up with their own ways of defining chronic versus transient groups. So how do we make that judgment call? Well, there is a chapter in the influential Piplau and Perlman text by Young, who suggested that we treat loneliness as chronic if it lasts for 2 or more years. Now, that chapter was written from the perspective of a clinician, and I thought it was interesting that this definition kind of mirrors the criteria for chronic depression in the DSM. Do we necessarily want to view loneliness as if it were a clinical disorder? I'm not so sure. But since we know loneliness does co-occur very highly with depression, I can understand the parallel being drawn there. Other studies have made the best they can with the data available to them. So this third bullet point is a recent paper of my own, where I had available to me measurements of loneliness that were taken at the ages of 12 and 18. And so I decided to treat people as chronically lonely if they reported loneliness at both of those ages. And I contrasted these with so-called remitted loneliness and new onset loneliness groups who were only lonely at one of those time points. And then similarly, these 2 studies at the bottom, they had more than 2 waves of data collection, and they were closer together. So they treated people as chronically lonely if they endorsed feeling lonely at 2 or more waves of data collection. So I guess the bottom line here is that there's no consistent way of doing it yet in the literature. There's no consensus. People just have to come up with a solution that makes theoretical sense while also working within the limits of their data set. Here's another approach that was taken in the BBC loneliness experiment, again by Pamela and colleagues. And here the authors asked not just about how lonely people were, but how often it happens, how intense that feeling is, and how long the feeling lasts when it occurs, ranging from hours to months or more. And within these data, they identified different groups of people. For example, people who had average levels of loneliness for a long time, versus people who had very intense loneliness, but for a shorter time. And these groups were differentiated by various demographic and health-related factors. There are far too many findings to go into all the detail here, but it's a very informative and useful publication. I think what's good about this is it's an example of how we can incorporate follow-up questions to the usual sets of questions that we use in order to yield new insights about the thing we're measuring. So using the existing measure, such as the UCLA, as a framework, but then going beyond just saying, how often do you feel this? How often do you feel that? Actually asking about multiple additional dimensions of the experience of loneliness, including the length of time it's experienced. So here are some concluding thoughts about how we could improve the ways that we conceptualize and measure chronic versus transient loneliness. And when I get to this point, I start to wonder if we're almost asking the wrong question. Are we being too reductive in trying to pigeonhole loneliness into these two categories? So it was touched on earlier that there's no magical threshold, or we haven't validated one at which someone goes from being having middling levels of loneliness to having severe. And in fact, there's no threshold really agreed on at which a person goes from being not lonely to lonely. And so in the same vein, I'm not sure it's necessary or desirable to draw a line in the sand where loneliness kind of goes from being transient to chronic. And one reason we might want to avoid that is because regardless of where we draw that threshold, loneliness experienced for, say, a month or a year is going to look different from loneliness that's experienced for 10 or 20 years. So maybe we want to think of the duration of, or the chronicity of loneliness as more of a sliding scale rather than a step change that kicks in after X amount of time. Either way, I think we really need to keep measuring loneliness prospectively. So cohort studies with repeated follow-ups are the way forward there. As I say, many existing cohorts didn't start including loneliness measures until fairly recently. So this is a long-term ambition, but one that's definitely worth pursuing. In the meantime, one approach could be to ask people retrospectively. So in a similar vein to that paper from the BBC experiment, we can ask people how lonely they are and follow up by saying, well, how long have you felt that way? Or we could ask them to think back over the past 10 years and ask them how much of the time they felt lonely for during that window. One cautionary note is that there are known issues with retrospective data. It can be prone to recall bias and other sources of error. One striking example of this in the clinical literature is when researchers compare retrospective versus prospective measures of childhood maltreatment. These two different measurement approaches seem to pick up largely different groups of individuals. And we could end up doing the same if we try to pinpoint chronically lonely individuals using prospective versus retrospective measures. So that's just one thing to be wary of. So I wouldn't say it's the ideal way to measure the chronicity of loneliness, but it could have utility in the absence of prospective data. Another way, and this is a bit more left field, could there be a way to measure the chronicity of loneliness almost by proxy? So rather than trying to directly measure how long a person is lonely for, can we figure out a way of capturing the type of person who is most likely to end up chronically lonely? In other words, can we find a set of indicators or risk factors that reliably distinguish people who become long-term lonely from those who only experience it briefly? I couldn't really speculate on what those indicators might be, but we could then use them in data sets where we don't have longitudinal data to refine a checklist of indicators that predicts an individual's risk of certain outcomes. So it's quite a long shot. I think it would be prone to a lot of error or low sensitivity or specificity. Plus, it would still require longitudinal data to validate it. But I guess that's an example of the sort of out-of-the-box thinking that we may need to explore in the future. But then finally, as a closing point, I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that even transient loneliness is still bad. So for whatever length of time loneliness is experienced, it's still a distressing situation to be in. And so it should be our priority to get people out of it ASAP. And just to illustrate that point, the paper of mine that I spoke about a few minutes ago, one of the findings we had was that children who experienced loneliness at the start of secondary school were more likely to finish school with lower qualifications, even if they were no longer lonely. So we shouldn't assume that people are out of the woods as long as they don't become a chronic case, because even transient loneliness could cast an enduring shadow. So I will finish there, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Tim. Lots of things to consider, and I can see from the chat that lots of people are resonating with the things that you've been saying. So do we have any questions for Tim? Let's have a look in the chat. Okay, so there's a question from Jessica. Does the question of chronic loneliness relate to the different types of loneliness? So we've obviously got social loneliness. So is social more transient compared to existential loneliness, which is more chronic? And she's saying that participants she's been speaking to who express a sense of separateness from others and difficulties forming relationships with people, that leads to long-term sense of loneliness. So I suppose, yeah, I mean, that notion of social versus emotional, the idea of existential loneliness, do you see them somehow feeding into this idea of transient and chronic loneliness at all?
Potentially, I suppose, because I guess with the in the case of social loneliness, the issue is, I guess, more tangible and kind of more easy to well, not easy to address, but it's clear how it could be resolved, whereas existential loneliness is something that runs a lot deeper and is a lot more personal. And yes, I think it's I think it would certainly be interesting to look at loneliness as something not just that happens to someone, but if there is a kind of particular sensitivity that means some people are more likely to be lonely across different situations than others, to see if there is not treating loneliness as a personality trait necessarily, but seeing if there are differences in individuals in terms of how they increase in loneliness. So we tend to look at kind of we get a sample of people and we look at average levels of loneliness and correlate them with something else. But I think it would be interesting to look at the level of the individual and see how they, their direction of travel over time. And there are ways of doing that with longitudinal data. But yes, I think that there are lots of individual differences which get kind of smoothed out when we look at kind of the bigger picture. So yeah, that's a very interesting thought, Jessica.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting idea, isn't it? And it's thinking more about people and profiles rather than means and numbers, which I think again resonates with a lot of people here. There's another question which might be nice to pick up on, probably because it's a question others might have. So this one from Sarah, she says, find it. So how do the measures of loneliness relate to measures of social isolation? Do you want to say anything about that, Tim?
Yeah, no, this is something that I've thought about a great deal for many years. And I think there could be a whole second workshop about how do we measure social isolation, because there are so many different ways of doing it and different indicators. And then much similar to, as we've been discussing with loneliness, different indicators are more applicable to different age groups. So in older age, a socially isolated person might be someone who lives in a remote area and doesn't have any family, or has recently lost a spouse, or is moving into residential care. But if you're trying to measure social isolation in younger people, these really don't apply. So there's a whole can of worms in how we reliably measure isolation. In terms of how those ways of measuring intersect with loneliness, there is an overlap. Obviously, if you are socially isolated, you're more likely to report feeling lonely. But then also, as we know, people can be surrounded by other people and still report feeling very, very lonely. So yes, there's an overlap there, but yeah, quite distinct.
And what's interesting, I think, is when we've had studies that look at both social isolation and loneliness within the same longitudinal study, we see that whilst they're related actually over time they are predicting quite different outcomes, whether that is educational outcome for younger people or health for older people. Yeah, something that I'd like to just kind of highlight again from your talk was that the transient loneliness is also important. I think there's been a move recently to focus very much on this chronicity and thinking, okay, it's about chronic loneliness and time. But like you've shown in your work, and we've shown it in some of our longitudinal work too, that transient loneliness can still have impacts later on. It has an impact on the way you're thinking about yourself and your social worlds. So it can still have an impact for certain types of people, and it's understanding those predictors. So yeah, I really have loved both talks so far. So thank you very much. Okay, so we will move on. Tim, if you're okay if you could answer the questions in chat. There's a few more. People have got quite a lot of questions for you. So I'll leave you to those, and we'll move on to our third speaker. And this is Fuchsia Suroy, who's from the University of Durham. And Fuchsia is a psychologist, and she's been working with Andrea Wigfield and another cross-sectional or cross-disciplinary research group to try and develop, I think, if I've understood it correctly, Fuchsia, a co-produced measurement. So there's some crossover, I think, with what Jennifer talked about earlier, but you've been engaging a lot, I think, in qualitative work with people. So I'm going to hand over to you. Very much looking forward to your talk as well. So over to you, Fuchsia.
Great, thanks, Pamela. Yeah, just let me get my slides up here. Let's see. Okay, share and get into, there we go. Everyone can see that then? Okay, perfect. Yeah, so it's great hearing the other two talks, and the nice thing about going last is a lot of the territory that I might have normally covered has already been covered in terms of measurement and the really key issues. I think some really excellent points there that's made me have another think about what we're doing as well. But yeah, so what I'm going to be presenting to you today is some of the thinking and work that has been developed with an interdisciplinary team, including Andrea Wigfield from the center. She's the director of the Center for Loneliness Studies at Sheffield Hallam University, and a few people from a number of other places. Helen as well is involved in this project. And we're currently trying to get some funding to get it up and running. We've been working on this for some time and developing the ideas. So it is quite a large project. And yes, there is some qualitative and there is some co-production. I'm not going to go into the details on that per se. I'm sort of the quant person on the team here. I'm the psychometrician. So I am going to talk about some of our reconceptualization of loneliness and how to measure it. And not to say that we replace existing measures, but perhaps moving to a different paradigm in our way of thinking about loneliness. And this is what we're proposing with our project, and indeed with sort of the new constructs and measurement tool that we're hoping to develop. So, in terms of our understanding and measurement of loneliness, we have our classic definitions. Jennifer put up about that gap between quality and quantity, and feeling isolated or socially disconnected, or feelings of loneliness, and all these sort of classic measures. But they do focus on our social connections, and the way of reducing loneliness is somehow about addressing that feeling of social disconnection, or feeling that you don't have that. Feeling that the relationships you have in your life are adequate. So relationships are clearly key for understanding loneliness. But we tend to, obviously if there's this negative state, we tend to look at the nature of these relationships from the lens in which we view loneliness, which is a deficit-based approach, right? So if someone's feeling lonely, it's because they're not. Yeah.
Could I just interrupt? Your slides aren't moving forward. Don't know.
Oh, they're not.
No, they're not. I think you need to put it on presenter view. Not presenter view.
Did that just work there?
No.
It looks like you've come off slideshow, Fuchsia. So
Oh,
they've
I
been
see.
going correctly at the beginning, but
Okay, so, slide control.
maybe.
No, it's not doing that. I don't know why that's not working. Okay, thank you for letting me know. Let's try something else. I'll do a stop share. So my screen sharing is paused.
Christian has said you've got present view on the wrong screen. I don't know what they mean. Sorry. Maybe Christian, you could help.
If you're using two screens, then maybe you projected the presenter screen onto the wrong screen.
I think what it is I've got two windows. Let me try this because let's try that. Is that something
Yes.
different?
Perfect.
Good.
Okay, good.
That's
I think it's because if I open the slideshow from within Zoom, it does this. I think that's what was happening. Okay, sorry about that, and thanks for spotting me on that. Okay, so yeah, as I was saying, we tend to view how we measure loneliness from this deficit-based approach, right? You're lacking something in your relationships and something missing in your life, and that also has an impact on how we think about loneliness and how we measure it. So we've been in this project trying to sort of turn things around a little bit more and think about loneliness in different ways. Now, I realize after seeing Helen's slides, she mentioned the same paper here. It's a great paper because it really does, how not to measure loneliness, right? And it really highlights this key point. And some of the things that I think I pulled out from this paper is slightly different from what Helen pulled out, is that the fact that all scales include items that do not measure loneliness. So we're not actually measuring loneliness with these scales. We're measuring sense of emptiness. Okay, but you could have the sense of emptiness in other states as well too. Or being easy to make new friends, but what type of friends are those? Are those friends who you have a real connection with, or are they superficial friends? Is that going to have anything to do with your level of loneliness? And they note, the authors note that for many skills, almost half of the items actually didn't measure loneliness. So it is a real issue, the measurement issue, and obviously that's the focus of this particular forum. And so going back to this idea of, loneliness in relationships, right? So, this deficit-based approach really focuses on what we're missing in our relationships from others. And although we talk about, and some of the definitions mention the quality of those relationships, we don't really go into a lot of depth about it. It's saying there's a mismatch between a quantity and quality. Okay, but what is a quality relationship? And is it just about having relationships? And how do we understand what that quality means? And I think, it was mentioned in one of the other talks too, it's not just about the individual too. There's other, so societal determinants of those relationships that are often not considered. So it's not, we often put the emphasis on the individual, that there's something about them, they're lacking in their relationships. Well, maybe there's societal and other structural issues that are contributing to these difficulties with their relationships, and also contributing to these feelings of loneliness. And so one of our ways in our conversations, and this really sort of the brainchild of Andrea's, is to sort of flip things around. And rather than talking about not having these types of relationships, why don't we come at it from understanding loneliness in terms of what, meaningful relationships? In other words, that when we have meaningful relationships in our lives, we tend to not experience loneliness. So rather than defining it from a deficit-based approach, looking at it from a strengths-based approach, which that approach inherently has within it sort of a focus on where we need to intervene and where we need to help bolster people to feel less lonely. And so that's one thing that I think was really significant about the project we're doing, is this really putting that spotlight on relationships. And seeing these as being central to understanding loneliness and when someone may or may not feel lonely. And here the idea would be a lack of meaningful relationships if you want to take a deficit-based approach, or when you have meaningful relationships, you're less likely to experience loneliness, which is more of a strengths-based approach. But we've gone beyond that too, because we've expanded it to not just relationships with others, because there's a growing body of literature that's also suggesting that our relationships with our place, okay, can have a key influence on the experience of loneliness. So feeling a sense of belonging to a culture or to a city, or even connectedness to nature. So that connectedness to a place is sort of bolstering that sense of identity and feeling belonging, right, more generally rather than specifically to people, has also been linked to having less feelings of loneliness. And obviously we know that meaningful relationships are key, but the research is starting to come out to show this as well too, that these meaningful relationships to others give us a different view on loneliness and how to address it, and certainly seem to be very critical for helping to resolve loneliness as well. And then the last type of relationship that we sort of widening this view of relationships, not just to others, but to place, is the relationship to self. Because there is a tendency to think with loneliness that somebody is alone, right? That being alone is a bad thing, right? That being alone means you're lonely. But these two things are not synonymous. It's more to do with how we view ourselves in some way. So we know that, some of the key researchers in the loneliness field have shown that when people feel lonely, they have a negative attitude towards themselves that can create a cycle of loneliness. But we also know from another growing body of literature, and there's some fabulous researchers here at Durham that are focusing specifically on this phenomenon of solitude, that actually, if you have a positive feeling of solitude, you enjoy being alone, what's happening there is that this is sort of akin to having a meaningful relationship with oneself. So again, sort of extending these relationships, that if we want to understand loneliness from a completely different perspective here, beyond in terms of relationships, but also in terms of taking a more strengths-based rather than deficit-based approach, maybe we need to look at loneliness in terms of our people's meaningful relationships to self, others, and place, right? And so the relationship to self could be about personal development and enjoying that time spent alone, spending some time on oneself rather than feeling sort of spread thin for others, in which case that's not really going to be a meaningful relationship to others as well. And again, the research on meaningful relationships in place, apart from the growing body of literature suggesting that connectedness to nature and sort of the environment, and that tends to also be linked to lower feelings of loneliness, but there's that sense of identity, I think, that comes from, again, being part of a culture, a city, a nation, an organization, right? And the place, those sorts of places, which may be more or less concrete or abstract, feed into a person's sense of belongingness and identity, which can, again, counteract those feelings of loneliness or feeling isolated. And then lastly, of course, we know, again, meaningful relationships to others. People, there's been several large-scale studies that have, population-based studies that have found that people who tend to not experience loneliness or to feel less lonely report having a greater number of meaningful relationships to other people. So sort of flipping the other side of the coin of loneliness, lack of relationships, is actually looking at meaningful relationships as being key. And so if we kind of turn things around then, and lots of meaningful relationships, and if we reconceptualize loneliness in terms of these meaningful relationships, then we might understand somebody who's lonely as someone who is lacking a meaningful relationship with themselves, who doesn't have a strong sense of connection or belongingness in terms of place, and doesn't have those meaningful relationships with others. So they might have a lot of superficial or sort of disconnected relationships with others, but those relationships aren't particularly meaningful, and those might be the circumstances under which they would start to feel more lonely. So, this raises the question, and this is sort of where our project sort of came into play here, is how do we measure meaningful relationships? There aren't any measures of meaningful relationships existing. There's some that maybe focus on personal relationships, but not the meaningfulness necessarily of those. They might look at relationship quality, which isn't quite the same thing as meaning. And there's certainly not a lot of the measures or any measures that we're aware of that look at this idea of meaningful relationship to self or meaningful relationship to place. And it is a hard thing to capture. You know, this was brought up, I think, just even talking about loneliness, right, too. Like, you know, the behavioral measures, or it's very highly subjective. So we kind of need to get, you know, understand what it is for that person, what meaning is. And meaning it of itself is, it reflects what's valuable and important to the individual. So what's meaningful to me may not be meaningful to somebody else in a relationship, or in relationship to myself, or even in terms of place. That being said, there is also, you know, some universals we can think of. So, you know, having a close friend you can find in, most people would say that that's a meaningful type of relationship, or having that sense of connection to a place or to nature that sort of bolsters your identity. We might say that that's meaningful. Or, you know, engaging in activities that spend time on self-development and self-exploration, that might be you know, representative of meaning too. So there are ways, I think, that we can get at this idea of these different meaningful relationships. So, you know, part of our plan is to develop this measure of meaningful relationships with self, place, and others. And so we can validate a new quantitative tool for the measurement of meaningful relationships. Now, as I said, this is part of a larger project where there will also be a qualitative tool developed at the same time. And the two work streams that we have planned will sort of, you know, intersect at certain points. And so some of the qualitative work will inform this quantitative work, and certainly there'll be co-production involved too. But again, it's a huge project that hopefully we'll get some support to launch. But I'm just going to be speaking about sort of more the quantitative side of things here. And so, you know, we look at, the aim is to look at people who are successful or unsuccessful in engaging in meaningful relationships across different contexts, and who have different personality characteristics and at different life transition points. So getting at that idea of sort of, you know, where along sort of the lifespan are people more or less likely to experience loneliness. And by taking that sort of broad approach then, and we hope to be able to, you know, address the issue of, you know, what statements best capture people's experience of meaningful relationships with self, place, and others. So we see this as sort of a multidimensional measure. And how are these meaningful relationships with self, place, and others linked to similar constructs, loneliness, and other consequential outcomes, the sort of outcomes we might expect to be linked to loneliness, and we know are linked to loneliness. How do these then relate to meaningful relationships as a way of sort of validating that measure? Okay, so we have 4 stages of development planned. And so we're starting from design to validity testing, to testing the nomological network, and then the predicted validity of the scale. Excuse my cough there. And so the first stage was probably the most important stage here, which is creating your items for this sort of what we call a pool of items that help capture each of these aspects of meaningful relationships. This will be driven by literature search, but we'll also have some qualitative work conducted with key stakeholders that will help feed into this. Then that will help with the generation of these items for this item pool, both the literature review and the qualitative, and then using expert review to reduce them because we don't want to start off with too many, and then refining the items. We're going to use something called the Think Aloud method, where we get people to sort of actively reflect on the items and what they mean to them to make sure that they're actually capturing sort of the aspects of meaning that we are hoping that they are. And then we start looking at the dimensionality of these constructs, because we are proposing this as a multidimensional measure, sort of with these 3 wings of self, place, and others in terms of meaningful relationships. And using, you know, a number of different techniques to assess what we call convergence. So how does it converge with similar constructs? How does it discriminate from other constructs? Does it predict what it should? Is it stable, or are they stable or less stable over time? What's their power in predicting things above and beyond, say, standard loneliness measures, for example, would be another test there. And then we have sort of a final test of the construct validity, which is something that involves establishing what we call the nomological network of a new construct. So because we're introducing these as relatively new constructs, if you like, of 3 different aspects of meaningful relationships, it's important to understand where they are situated within sort of the family of related constructs. And this can be done a number of different ways, but one of the ways that we're proposing is use something that's quite novel and being used now in psychological research is network analysis. And basically it sets up the items or the scale means from each of these subscales and looks at how they connect positively or negatively. So the stronger the connector in these sort of these nodes, each piece is a node in that network, the stronger the connectors, the stronger the relationship. And then you've got green for positive and red for negative relationships. So it basically just gets you sort of where it sits within this larger network or universe of similar constructs, so that you can get a feel for if it's actually the scales are performing the way you expect them, or are they predicting the sort of things, but are they connected to similar constructs or different enough from other constructs in more of a visual way. And then the last stage is then really looking at the predictive validity, and this is where we would hope to look at them in different contexts and with different groups. So doing in the workplace with employees, and then certain groups who are more at risk for loneliness, we wanted to see if how the scales might perform with those individuals. And then also in certain environments, right? So again, especially with respect to understanding the idea of meaningful relationship with place. So people in the home context, in different types of homes, in neighborhoods, in digital space, and again, in the workplace, just to get a broader understanding of sort of the performance of these scales, and also if there are shifts in the types of meaningful relationships people have as a function of the context in which they're in. So I guess sort of just to finish up then, I guess, we can think about loneliness up in the traditional way, which is a sort of a lack of meaningful relationships across these different areas. So, both with self, place, and others, so moving away from just others, but also thinking about terms of place and self. But I think ultimately the aim here too is really to have that paradigm shift now. It's not that we discount the construct of loneliness, it's now that we need to move forward and thinking from, a perspective of what can be done to address loneliness, viewing it from a more strengths-based approach, and looking at and measuring meaningful relationships so that we can better understand loneliness, who's going to be more at risk, and also how we might help reduce loneliness overall for people. And that's all I've got for you. Thanks for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you, Fuchsia. It's really interesting to see that there are several teams like yours that are coming at loneliness from a similar angle. There's PhD student at Buckinghamshire, Lisa Jones, who again, she's only focusing on self, from what I know, kind of that meaningful relationship with oneself as being a key component of loneliness. So yeah, thinking more from the positive perspective. So really, really interesting talk. So we had, I think that Christian just had his hand up. Am I right there?
That was just a clap.
Oh, it was a clap. Oh, wonderful.
But I did have the comment that the others part is really, really well and in depth done with 60 qualitative interviews by Spencer and Parle in 2006, published by Princeton. Really rich book, and they are basically looking at qualitative personal communities. So that goes quite a long way where you want to go.
Yeah. Thank
Excellent.
you.
Thank you.
Other comments? We've got time just for one more, I think. Yes, Miri.
Hi there, thanks for that. Really, really interesting. I'm a social psychologist, so we are really interested in meaningful relationships, and we use the social identity framework in order to measure social relationships. And we've done quite a lot of research where we show that strength of social identification, friends, family, and so on, very strongly, as you would expect, correlated with loneliness, and it allows us to pick apart mediating variables like social support and so on and so forth. So I think that's a useful framework, which has that strengths-based approach. I also study place identity, and I find that bit really interesting, and I think it's innovative, and it ties in with some of the earlier seminars that we've had about loneliness, say in the built environment, and particularly interested in how places can be exclusionary for some parts of the community and how that manifests. So I'm going to be watching your work with great interest. Sorry, I have a barking dog. But my question is really about how you conceptualize place and where you draw the lines between the physical place and the social elements of place, because I think there's a complexity there that's often misunderstood, and it sometimes lies between the divisions in environmental psychology and social psychology. And one of the ways that we've tried to address that is to look at the notion of community, which allows us to talk about neighbourhoods, but also people within communities. And I'll send you a link that you might find interesting on some studies that we've done about community identity and loneliness. But I guess I just wondered how you're going to navigate that, you know, how you're going to draw those lines between physicality and sociality.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. I think at this stage, I think we've come in very broad because, you know, obviously until you can start conducting the work, you know, you can't sort of narrow and refine. So I think our perspective has been that, yeah, digital space is place. And I think this has been the experience, certainly coming off the tail of the pandemic, where, you know, so many have moved to online virtual spaces, that these are real spaces, and these are places where, you know, you can have that connection to a digital community, or you can have connection to others. And I think the other thing that it really didn't get into is, you know, we separated out this sort of relationship to self, you know, meaningful relationship to self, place, and others, but these actually converge. So this is what we're expecting, you know, is that they will be separate subscales, that they'll be, you know, distinct, but that it will also be synergy between them, right? And so I think that gets really well illustrated. And like you're saying, how do you define between you know, concrete space and actual virtual space? Well, maybe you don't, because maybe there's actually a convergence there in terms of place, and also in terms of social relationships and relationship to self. So I think, you know, this is what our approach has been, to not be really exclusive at this point, because we need to go in, we need to get the data, we need to do the qualitative interviews, we need to start seeing what that will look like. And I think it'll be a really interesting exploration.
I think you'll find in your literature reviewing that people sometimes come down one are sitting in one camp or the other, but there's often a lot of people who are conflating the two, and that can be quite tricky to navigate. That's but interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I want to say a big thank you to our speakers. Really, really great to listen to all three talks. I'm going to hand over to Helen, who I think is going to take us on to talk about the breakout rooms, but also introduce a poll. Am I right?
Yes, I'm going to reduce a very complex subject to a kind of very oversimplified set of questions for you now. I mentioned earlier that Simon Hunter had written this blog for us, and actually, oh good, Jenny's just put a link to it up there. So yeah, in a slightly silly way, we thought we'd ask you which of the kind of key issues that he refers to in the blog do you think is most pressing or of most interest to you? And if you don't want to choose any of those, you can put an alternative in the chat as well, and perhaps these are things that we might pick up in the breakout rooms afterwards. So Rachel, if you want to launch the poll. Great. So yes, he talked about improvement of measurement of chronic versus transient loneliness, increasing use of measures which better tap into the discrepancy between what we want from social relationships and what we believe we have, and developing measures of loneliness for children and young people, which are meaningful and relevant to them, which I think Jennifer's going to vote for. And yeah, or if there's anything else that is particularly of interest, it's useful for us to know. So go ahead and vote. I'll give you 10 more seconds. Okay, Rachel, do you want to end the poll and let's have the results. Okay, chronic versus transient loneliness wins, Tim. But okay, that's interesting to know. And please do keep writing your thoughts in the chat, and that will be a good record for us as well. Okay, so thank you. Thanks so much to all our speakers and to everyone who's asked questions and engaged in such an interesting conversation. There's sort of so much there for us to reflect on. So we're going to move on to 3 breakout rooms now, each with one of the speakers, a staff member facilitating, and someone taking notes who will feed back when we come back together at the end. And I think we've got 20 minutes for those. So
now let's just give a very general overview, feedback session. So shall we go with Miri's group? So group 1, do you want to feedback for us, Miri?
Yeah, sure. So we had a lot of discussion around the flaw of using questionnaires, particularly as it relies a lot on introspection and people might not have much insight into their own feelings of loneliness. So this was discussed particularly in relation to people with dementia and also younger people. So there was some suggestion on using non-verbal techniques or creative activities such as the use of diaries or songs to try and capture feedback from people in that way. Also spoke about social prescribing and just how we might capture some feedback from people and what type of questions we might be using. And I think the feeling was it's maybe not too clear cut. We need to think about what that social prescribing is actually trying to achieve for that particular person. And then the end of our group discussion, we didn't have a chance to fully finish it, but it sort of ventured into discussion around social media and digital technology and, you know, how we can measure what impact that's having in terms of reduction around loneliness. But we got cut off before we got back together, but that's the main points from our group.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So Robin, did you have similar things or did you talk about different things?
Completely different things.
Yeah.
So we were talking about some of the difficulties that people have kind of on the debate about whether loneliness is difficult to ask about. And I think that kind of where we broadly ended up with was that for face-to-face interviewers in kind of doing qualitative or kind of research, that seems to be very, very doable, and is maybe a different thing where if you're just giving someone a blank sheet of paper at the end of a session and asking them to tick some boxes, that this is maybe or if it's online, this is at least maybe a somewhat different thing. We also had really interesting contributions with some people who are asking these questions and some of the kind of linguistic issues that people have with some of the UCLA ones, people having having very variable understandings of companionship and so on. And then just as the final, just we're finishing up, which kind of slightly sets us up for the coming session, is to try to think through practical ways in which we can find the questions that are more likely to show the change and impact of services, and trying to kind of conduct evaluations in ways that can see change over time, and hopefully with enough people and some kind of way of finding a control. And exactly how I do that, we did not even slightly get into, but I think would be immensely valuable if we could. So yeah, really, really different and really practical.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Robin. Jenny, do you want to give an overview of our group?
It came up was about how can we measure the value of loneliness, and is there any value in the loneliness that we feel? And an example was given of how bringing people together with a shared experience can also be a bonding experience. So bringing people together chronically lonely may be a useful way to tackle that experience of loneliness. And then another question that came up, which was an example was given of somebody who was working with old adults, and how can we measure the impact of a program? So you measure the loneliness at the beginning and you implement different activities during that loneliness program. But sometimes the loneliness scales don't really help measure the impact of those programs. So somebody suggested they'd love some kind of measurement question, which would help people on the ground, practitioners, show the effectiveness of the different programs they're working on. And Pam's response was, watch this space. DCMS are working in England on this, and obviously it's something that we'll maybe asking in the second seminar on the 24th of November as well. There was also a question around the fact that the UCLA scales were not sensitive enough and only had 3 measures, which was difficult to capture the experience of older people, perhaps who'd been in a loneliness program for quite some time, particularly frail, for example. And then I suppose the last thing really is around life stages, which came up, obviously, in terms of, it was felt that older people are better equipped to rationalise loneliness and deal with loneliness, and younger people are less able to do that. And obviously there's the example of the BBC loneliness study was given. So young people find loneliness really intense as they've not experienced it before. And so when we're older, we've obviously developed some resilience tools to loneliness. And there was a question, the last question was about mindfulness and about whether mindfulness can be an approach used in terms of supporting people that are lonely, in terms of developing their own tools. And it was fair to say that the response was that self-compassion can be a very useful way to tackle loneliness.
Wonderful. So great summaries of people's discussions, lots of really interesting things. And I think all of them actually will be key things that we'll pick up on in the next workshop, where we'll get to meet Jo Badcock, who will talk about the importance of being able to measure change via our tools, our measurement tools. She, as I said right at the very beginning, she's got some really good insight into that. Being a clinician, but also an academic, she is really focused on making sure that the tools that we develop can be applied and can be used by clinicians. So lots of really great ideas that she'll be bringing up next time. I suppose really what I should do, I think now, Helen, is you want me to probably round things up. So remind people that they will, that Helen will be sharing the recording, so people will have access to that. So people who've had to leave early will be able to see how we've rounded things off. And also there's a request to have a look at the feedback form that you will get, which I think Helen will be sending through. Please,
it should pop up automatically at the end.
Oh, should it? Oh, right. Okay. Okay, so if we see that at the end, we're to fill it in, please, so that Helen gets our feedback. And that'll be useful, I think, for kind of deciding how to organise the one with Jo, won't it? Yeah. So again, thank you very much to our speakers and to everybody for contributing to the breakout rooms. And we look forward to seeing you on the 24th of November when we'll meet Jo Badcock.